Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. This show is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awake, or I prefer the word awakening, people. There are over 280 of them now, so if you'd like to check out the archives and perhaps support our efforts through the donation, go to batgap.com and explore. These interviews are also being live streamed these days, so most people watching this won't be watching it live, but if you'd like to watch future ones live and perhaps submit questions, go to the upcoming interviews page on batgap.com and you'll see instructions on how to do that. So my guest today is Ellen Emmett, and I'm just going to read a bio that Ellen sent in because it's a nice synopsis. It'll very concisely give you an overview of what Ellen is about. Ellen's deepest longing for the Absolute was fulfilled when she met her teacher, Francis Lucille, whom I've interviewed on this show. In his presence over many years, she awakened to her true nature of peace and happiness through continuous and deepening glimpses. The process of aligning and stabilizing her life to and in this beautiful non-dual understanding has never ceased to unfold since then. As a child, Ellen was in love with movement and dance. My sister, by the way, is a yoga. She's been dancing all her life, and she has all kinds of certification and training in yoga dance, which you'd probably find interesting. Yeah. Sorry for the interruption. To tell you that. She knew without words the joy and limitless transparency that the body dissolved into when it was free and alive. As an adolescent and young adult, she acutely felt and enacted suffering through her body, struggling with an eating disorder and with depression. Thus, the experience that we call the body has always been central to all of Ellen's experiences, both in the ignoring and in the recognition of her true nature. Today, Ellen lives in Oxford, England, with her husband Rupert Spira, whom I've also interviewed twice on this show, a teacher in the tradition of non-duality. She has a private practice as a psychotherapist and facilitator of authentic movement. We'll be talking about authentic movement. Her background of dance movement therapy and transpersonal psychology has been deeply influenced by the non-dual understanding. Ellen also offers meetings called The Awakening Body, an exploration of the body and a perception sourced in the teaching tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, Jean Klein, and Francis Lucille. During these sessions, our true nature is explored at the level of the body and of the sense perception. Ellen has master's degrees in dance movement therapy from NYU and transpersonal psychology from JFK University. She has a certificate in Laban movement analysis, and her other teachers and mentors were Janet Adler and Marion Woodman, who provided great guidance and support in the realms of feminine wisdom, archetypical energies, and intuitive knowing. That's a good overview. So, as usual, Ellen, in preparation for this, I read as much as I had time to. I was reading a long scholarly article on your website, which I was finding interesting, and I also listened to as many audio recordings as I could find. I was just listening to the one you did with Marlise Kosheret on Conscious TV. And right in the beginning of your introduction, you talk about she awakened to her true nature of peace and happiness. Just so that, probably everybody listening to this show has a sense of what that means, but just so that we're all on the same page, why don't you describe what you mean by true nature and the experience of awakening to it?
Okay. True nature, what I mean by true nature is awareness, what we call consciousness, and the awakening was a moment, but the result of maybe a long kind of journey. But the moment of recognition, the moment of awakening, was when I heard Francis Lucille say on a tape. He said the words consciousness knowing itself, and at that moment there was a kind of a yes within me, a kind of just a recognition, a resonance. And of course it wasn't kind of clear at that moment what that resonance was about. So then there were many visits and lots of time spent with Francis, where all the vocabulary, which of course I'd been exposed to through readings and meetings, etc., but the kind of formulations of what true nature means became clear at the level of the mind. And it was what is meant by that, and what I understand by that, by true nature, is the knowing of my being, not my being Ellen, woman, individual, but my being that right this moment, very ordinary I that is hearing these words, that is feeling sensations, and that if I begin to investigate what that I is, I can come to the knowing, the direct knowing that it's not limited to a body and a mind. So, and of course, you know, I could speak for 2 hours about that.
Oh, well, that's exactly what we're going to do.
But it's the knowing of my true nature is the recognition of the unlimited nature of I, and the ever-present nature of I.
Okay.
And of course that comes in the beginning as a glimpse or a moment of recognition, and then I guess the journey is the establishment in that. And
yeah. Progressive. As you may recall, the last words I spoke to you and Rupert in
Yes.
California was Rupert, the direct path is progressive.
Exactly, but it's right. It's direct and it's progressive both at the same time. It's not a paradox. It's just both at the same time. Progressive in the sense of the establishment process, and that's beautiful unfolding, a real unfolding, and direct because right here, right now, we can abide as awareness.
Yeah. And I like the way you phrase this here. Continuous and deepening glimpses. And then you said the process of aligning and stabilizing your life to and in this beautiful non-dual understanding has never ceased to unfold since then. I was just watching this talk that Adyashanti and Francis Bennett gave last week out in California, and they were talking about people who run around saying, "I'm done," you know. And Francis said, "What do you mean you're done? Did somebody stick a fork in you?" And you know, they were sort of kind of playing with the absurdity of saying that one is done with a capital D when the actual experience of life seems to be a never-ending unfolding.
Yes, I think you can always perfect the alignment process. And I guess some people are more or less done, you know, but then it's a celebratory process, and I don't think it ever ends, to be honest.
I don't either, and I don't know if I've ever met anyone who is done, although I've met some people who say they are, but I can't believe that there isn't still some alignment and refinement and attunement and whatnot that
Exactly.
could still be, you know, undergone.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the beauty of it in a way, you know. After awakening, the beauty of it is this unending process of this understanding permeating all areas of life, and that's quite a vast project, you know. All of a sudden, all these doors open, and all these areas of exploration. For the understanding can percolate throughout so many levels. There's not enough of a lifetime, really.
You were mentioned in that thing that I was reading that you wrote. You said, you quoted Rumi as saying, "The physical form is of great importance. Nothing can be done without the association of the form and the essence. The body is fundamental and necessary for the realization of the divine intention." And I think I wanted to read that just now because it relates very much to what we're saying. If we think of the body as an instrument, then, you know, I suppose in an orchestra, to use that metaphor, you know, at a certain point your violin is tuned up and you can start playing. But in life, I kind of feel that the physical body through which we realize the divine intention, as Rumi put it, can be tuned up ad infinitum. You know, there's no end to the attunement.
Absolutely. And I mean, first of all, the body, I think, needs to be liberated. Even after the awakening, more often than not, the body is still kind of felt and experienced in accordance with the old belief of being a separate consciousness, because it's very anchored as a conditioning, obviously. So in order for that to begin to relax and the body to actually begin to be felt and experienced in accordance with this new understanding, it takes some some real exploration, which actually is not always undertaken. So, I mean, I think that's the area of the teaching that particularly resonates or is particularly interesting to me in terms of what I like to share. But yes, I think with the body, it's a long-term project.
Lifetime, as you said.
Lifetime, yeah, and beautiful, really a beautiful one.
So let's keep playing with this idea of awakening to true nature and being done and realizing and all that, because I think that you know, a lot of people listen to these kinds of words and they have a sense that there's some kind of finality to awakening or some sort of, you know, watershed moment that one crosses, and again, there are people running around saying they're done, but most people, that's not going to jibe with most people's direct experience. Most people are going to feel that, you know, they've had awakenings and then there's another one, and then and you know, there still seems to be this attunement and growth taking place, and so it can kind of actually inculcate a doubt where one feels that, well, I must, you know, I'm not there yet, and there must be a there that I'm going to get to. And you know, since I don't feel like I've reached it, then it kind of keeps them in a limbo state where they're still perhaps doubting their own experience more than they need to.
Well, I guess I think I was lucky. Well, I was lucky. I don't know if I was more or less lucky than anybody else. But what I feel is important in my experience is that there's a point where you meet the absolute understanding is met and recognized, and that moment is absolute. I mean, it's not a moment, but that recognition is the awakening to your true nature, and it's a true anchor. And if the teacher or the teaching is clear and experiential, and over and over again through a kind of process of higher reasoning with the mind or higher sensing with the body, you go over the pathway from a belief in separation to the understanding of your true nature. You do it over and over again, but with a map that's steady and within which there's no doubt. It's absolutely certain. So that I feel is important. That it's not wishy-washy. An awakening, it's a possibility to have a real awakening, you know.
Yeah.
And then what's more layered and more of a process is the alignment process. So it's we're no longer talking about awakening. The awakening happens. You are awake. You know what you are, but you seem to go back and forth. You seem to forget. You seem to re-shrink yourself into the feeling of being a limited awareness. But because there's been this deep recognition, and if you're lucky, a kind of map, you know, through then there's always the possibility of going over it again and again and again, and that's the establishment process. I mean, that I don't know if that's true for everybody. It's my experience, but so I think of people who feel that that they're still engaged in a process. There could be two things: either it hasn't been there's still a confusion about what I am or what this awakening is, and it needs to be met with something clear, or they're engaged in this alignment process and they know that, you know, and they do that around the teaching that suits them. Am I making sense?
Yes, you are. And let's take those two things that you just laid out and try to explore them. So the first one was, you know, it sounded kind of intellectually rigorous, and I imagine, you know, Francis Lucille being a rather intellectual fellow, it was intellectually rigorous in your experience. I mean, Francis is very
intellectual, yeah, but I wouldn't say intellectual, because intellectual
not exclusively.
Well, intellectual in the sense that it uses the mind.
Yeah.
But experiential, and it was for me. And I'm not somebody who gravitates towards thinking so much. I was more into devotional and flow and dance and movement. And it was interesting that the teacher that somehow was chosen was this, as you say, very rigorous
physicist,
and, you know, French and French, rationalist.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's this aspect. It's rigorous. You're right. It's rigorous because it takes the mind step by step back to its source, and it doesn't let the mind go off on a tangent, or it's a process of, but it's truly experiential. You know, it's just as experiential as doing something through the energy body, or through a kind of less rational process.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yes, it's rigorous, and you know, I have to admit that I think that's super important.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to admit it. I admit it happily. Is that the cat?
That's a dog. We don't have a cat anymore. We had a couple of cats, but they both died of old age. So,
That's nice.
in fact, if you watch some of my early interviews, you sometimes see a cat walking across, or I'll hold up the cat or whatever. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, they passed away. Yeah. So intellectually rigorous. So I didn't mean to imply that it was
No.
exclusively intellectual, like you're just sort of philosophizing and, you know, getting into metaphysics and so on. But there's an intellectual component, and it's sort of a multidimensional thing, isn't it, where the intellect is involved, but in a sense to corroborate direct experience. As if in walking we have a left foot and a right foot, and so there's the experience and then the understanding, and the experience and then the understanding, and the two complement and support one another.
Yes, you could say that. Yeah. Yeah, it's using the mind. You're right. It's intellectual in the sense that the mind is the tool that's used step by step, following the experience
Yeah.
of investigating, of self-inquiry. But yeah.
Yeah, and if we can imagine one without the other, I mean, the experience could be anything without without sort of the intellectual discrimination. One could mistake some mood for the real enchilada, or you know,
have real enchilada, but not have the formulation that helps. It feels to me that the formulation is so important. The right formulation.
What do you mean by formulation?
Well, for example, when I heard, when I stuck a tape of Francis's in my car, and I'd been given all, anyway, I stuck it in. It was in the middle of a teaching, and I heard consciousness knowing itself. So that's a formulation, right? It uses languages, and it was like it brought me to understanding. In other words, my mind must have, it's through the mind that there was a kind of dissolving into true nature. Yeah. It could have been another pathway, but
so at that point, when you heard that phrase, did it really dissolve into true nature, or was it more like an aha thing, which kind of like you realized, oh, there's something here, I need to investigate this more, that maybe I'm more than I thought I was, and I need to explore this? Was it just like the first inkling of a sense that there's a universal aspect to you, or was it actually a real shift?
I think there was already, you know, I'd done my little journeying already, so there was already an inkling, and at that moment it was a real glimpse, you could say.
Yeah, you could taste it.
It was a kind of yes that was coming from presence, from awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the Upanishads, they have these things that they call Mahavakyas. You've probably heard them, right?
Yeah.
Like that thou art, and you know, Tat Twamasi, and all those things. And it's said that when you're ripe, just that little phrase spoken by the teacher can elicit a huge shift.
Yes, but and I guess that was a Mahavakya, but it was using the mind, wasn't it? Consciousness knowing itself. It was.
Well, that's what the Mahavakyas do.
It had to kind of turn back onto itself and dissolve. You know, I mean, I wasn't aware what was happening. I mean, I wasn't. I was very new to all of that. It's now looking back that you can kind of deconstruct all these what are they? I don't know, these processes.
Well, that's in keeping with what we're talking about, which is this sort of intellectual rigor along with direct experience.
Yes.
And it seems like that phrase, when you heard it, what was it? Consciousness being aware of itself?
Consciousness knowing itself.
Knowing itself. It sort of actually triggered a kind of a self-referral moment there.
That's right. Yeah.
So that was when you were very kind of initially introduced to Francis, right? Somebody gave you a
Yeah.
tape or something and you hadn't really gotten into it?
Yeah, but the funny thing is, I'd been much more drawn towards a kind of devotional quality of, I'd gone to India, I'd gone to see Amma, I had this dream that was very devotion. Well, anyway, I've a much more devotional kind of Shakti, you could say, a kind of tendency, and then I was introduced to the non-dual direct path, and it was so resonant. It was strange,
Yeah.
It was, in a way, beautiful because.
Do you find now that having been on that path for over a decade that you've discovered the devotional nature of a devotional stream within that as well?
Yes, I've had to kind of. Yes, it's very much so. I mean, I feel it when I teach the awakening body meditations. I always start in a kind of devotional way because I feel like, it's almost like turning back towards an altar, and the altar is presence, and of course the presence that turns towards the altar is the very same presence. But yes, I feel like devotion is still very much a kind of expression that's here. And I feel like I've been thinking back on my time before meeting Francis when I was in India, and I had this very powerful dream when I was in India, which I had been thinking back upon because I'm not somebody who has powerful dreams. So this dream kind of stands out, and I realized the whole teaching was contained in that dream, but yet it was much more, its form was much more devotional. But now I can go back to that dream and see that the non-dual teaching is contained in it, and kind of let it inform how I express this understanding.
Yeah. Personally, I don't think that it has to be an either-or situation, and I don't think that it ever is, actually, entirely. I know naturally some people are more intellectually inclined and some are more emotionally inclined and so on, but the greatest proponents of non-duality were very devotional people.
Yeah.
Shankara
Yeah.
wrote all these devotional poems and talked about devotion, and Ramana Maharshi was very devoted.
Yes,
Um,
and Francis,
Nisargadatta. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Francis, often when he during his retreats, he does these guided meditations in the early days, and I think still now, but they were extremely devotional, not in a dual way, but they start out with really beautiful imagery, sometimes taken from the Christian tradition, of surrendering, for example, surrendering the body, surrendering the mind, surrendering the world to an altar. I remember this particular meditation of Francis's, and then him explaining, somehow that the altar to which you surrender is presence, of course, is consciousness, but that's the true meaning of sacrifice, in making sacred the body and the mind. All those meditations were very devotional.
Yeah. And I think it stands to reason because, as human beings, we have these different faculties or components, and one of them is the heart. And if you're going to be a fully developed human being, then, you're not going to be one of these bug-eyed space aliens that doesn't have any heart and it's great big head and oval eye. There's going to be, we have all these energy centers in the body, and they're all going to wake up eventually, perhaps in a different order for different people, but eventually, if we're really going to keep progressing, as we've been discussing, it seems to me they're all going to get fully enlivened eventually.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and love seems to, if we're to try to name the kind of attributes, qualities of consciousness, as Rupert says in some of his, when he says, it's our awareness is intimately one with all experience, and that's another name for that is love. And so, love and intelligence, beauty, all of these are different layers. Intelligence, love.
Yeah.
Beauty is the world. So yes.
You read these beautiful accounts in the scriptures, Vedic literature, and perhaps other traditions of, someone encounters a saint, and the saint might be a great intellectual and teacher and, proponent of Vedic wisdom or something, but someone comes to meet him and tears come to their eyes, and
Yes.
their hair stands on end, and they just melt in you know, waves of love and devotion.
Yeah. Francis never did that, but
Yeah. Well, anyway, I just want to throw that in there because sometimes in the so-called non-dual world, there seems to be a dryness, and I think that people
I
are
think
kind
that's
of
true.
people are kind of moving beyond that now. That was also one of the themes of Adya's and Francis Bennett's talk last week, that there seems to be a whole shift taking place in the contemporary spiritual community where people are kind of waking up to these more personal values which they at one time may have denounced or felt they had transcended.
yes. Yeah. Yeah, and also the maybe in the kind of neo-Advaita teaching, it's been confusing for people. There's nothing to do, nobody there, and that can be a bit dry too, because
Very.
people might have a glimpse, which isn't dry, in the presence of that teaching, but then a few days later, it feels kind of blank. Nobody there, nothing to do, and yet all these, you know, old feelings are there, and a kind of absence of perfume or a absence of. So that's another way in which the Advaita teaching, the contemporary Advaita teaching, can be a bit dry.
Yeah.
It's.
And in my opinion, not really in tune with its roots, with the traditional Advaita teaching, which included the heart and which
Yeah.
wasn't dry. As I've been saying, the main proponents of it were not dry by any definition. They were very heart filled, and
Yes.
transcendent and immanent both in one embodiment.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I guess the other trap, which might be part of today's
Scene.
well, scene, and it, is the kind of psychologizing of the spiritual teaching, and I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm a therapist, and I think it's very, I'm very interested in the emotional components and the personal aspects of the unfolding, but I also feel that it's a tricky balance. What are we serving? Who are we serving here in this exploration? Is it serving a kind of a person still? If we're too exploring the personal process too much.
Yeah.
I'm not being very clear, but
I think I know what you mean. So what you're saying, well, let's rephrase it. So probably what we're aiming at is the complete package, where we have the transpersonal, the transcendent, the impersonal, the unmanifest, the absolute, whatever you want to call it. But then we have the whole range of relative personal faculties and experiences and strata of creation and all that. And we're aiming at a package which includes them both. And one can go to one extreme or the other, to the transcendent, to the exclusion of the personal, and run around referring to oneself as the Rick person rather than just saying I'm Rick. Or
are people doing that?
Yeah, people do that. They won't just say how do you do? I'm Rick. They'll say I'm the Rick person, and there's nobody here, so on and so forth. Please pass the salt. Who wants the salt? I mean,
But that's really, absurd and silly.
It is, but people do it.
Yeah.
And then the other extreme, which you're just saying, is one can indulge in all sorts of, personal, psychological, emotional, this and that, without actually bringing the transcendent into the picture. And there's no end to, one can spend lifetimes doing that, mucking around without actually building a foundation under it.
Yes. I mean, technically and hopefully, a sound non-dual teaching will, it's true, put the emphasis in the beginning on establishing the fact of awareness and exploring the qualities of awareness, because it has to be, we have to start there. We have to uproot the illusion of separation. So it seems that the emphasis is placed on
Yeah.
but it's also a deep desire to do that in the students when he or she hears the teaching. But then in the best of cases, the teacher, and nobody's perfect, nobody will do it perfectly, but it will point towards a direction that allows this teaching to be explored at all levels, and that will kick up all sorts of things. Or in other words, it should start from the absolute, and then and not start from a person trying to change consciousness. So it's true there isn't a person there, but on the other hand, if it feels that there's a person there, let's investigate.
Like we said earlier, paradox.
Yeah,
and
also
Jesus said what you just said 2,000 years ago: "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all else should be added unto thee."
There you go.
Yeah. But seek ye first. So the priority is, get that established, and then all else shall be added.
And also the rest, if that really is taking place in the best possible way, the rest takes care of itself more or less. But I think maybe in the contemporary, what's good about the contemporary exploration is people really want to make sure that that's taking place, and want to cooperate with that, and explore what tools we can use to allow that more, maybe in the realm of psychology, in the realm of men, women, the feminine, and
no, I think it's important.
The spiritual bypass, all those concerns, they're legitimate, but they have to be in good measure, I guess.
Yeah. Well, like you just said, that once that's established, all the relative stuff gets taken care of by itself, more or less. I think you said something like that just now. But then in the next breath, you said, yeah, but there's all these other things you can do to help facilitate that. And I've seen many instances in my own life as well, and during some of its phases, in which all kinds of relative stuff wasn't getting taken care of. There's plenty of immersion in the absolute, but that didn't necessarily automatically bring all phases of the relative into line. And
in your own, you mean?
In my own experience, and other people too. You can see people who've been, meditating for decades and all or whatever, that are still like pulling shady business deals, or screwing up relationships, and stuff like that. You can see famous teachers who are radiating Shakti out the wazoo, but are messing around with their students in inappropriate ways, and all kinds of things like that. So yeah.
Well, I guess that's their freedom, but also I would question the depth of their understanding, or the how in love are they with their true nature? I mean, and that's their freedom.
And how holistic is their development? Ken Wilber's lines of development, they could be way out on one line and pretty stunted in other lines.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's get back to you a little bit more. So movement and dance. You were in love as a child with movement and dance, and you still are into it. And you went through a phase, you were born in New York, you spent 18 years in France, then you moved back to the States, I think, to California, was it? And
New York.
New York. And you went through a lot of suffering as a child, eating disorder, depression, what was it, bulimia or anorexia or something like that?
Bulimia was my chosen one.
Your eating disorder of choice. And so how did you pull out of that phase without killing yourself?
Well, I went the route of therapy, psychotherapy. Not that psychotherapy necessarily did the job of pulling me out. I just a journey, some therapy, a lot of trying to heal through certain approaches that were more honoring of the feminine, that kind of thing. So, and some of these things were very helpful, but I have to say that, the real uprooting of that suffering was meeting Francis, even though I never mentioned, that it was never addressed head on by the teaching, but it's because the root of any kind of addiction or is the belief that I am a body and that I will die. And so, you can do all sorts of therapies, and some of them were very helpful. And I'm a therapist, and I meet people in the ways that I was met by some therapies, but it was the ultimate understanding that was so relaxing for me. It was so relaxing to hear and to begin to feel in the yogas that Francis would lead, even though again, it was not a psychological investigation, but simply to first of all feel my body and to realize that I'm not in the body is in me, and that its substance, its very substance is consciousness, vibration. It's innocent, the body, you know. It took time. I mean, you know, it wasn't like healing overnight or anything, but it was much less charged to have this addiction. Was no, so what, you know, it was going to unwind in its own time.
So I've only encountered Francis in sort of a speaking mode, you know, interviewing him, seeing him speak at the SAND conference and everything, but I've heard you allude to the fact that he actually does some kind of yoga sessions, and then I also heard somebody, maybe it was you, maybe it was my previous guest, John Prendergast, talk about how Jean Klein had some kind of yoga thing that people would be doing. So tell us, you know, I should probably ask Francis this again sometime, but maybe in the context of what you went through, tell us about what your time with Francis entailed in terms of practices and this yoga thing, how that worked, and you know, what sort of effects it had, and so on.
Yes, I mean, Jean Klein was very much offering an exploration of the body, and so is Francis, so is Rupert in his retreats, and it's very much a part of their teaching, and also it's the yoga that I offer, and it was a very resonant for me when I went to Francis. His retreats are usually composed of a morning. Well, now he does everything in the afternoon because he likes to play tennis. And
Yeah.
But basically, the first part of his retreat, the first session, is a meditation and what he calls a yoga session. But it's a yoga that doesn't involve any kind of fancy postures. It's very, very slow. And
you're sitting on a mat doing something?
You might be sitting on a mat, but you can be sitting on a chair, and your eyes are closed, and the first thing that is established, of course, is awareness. But at the level of feeling, awareness is experienced almost like an open, infinite space-like openness, a bit like the sky, and then you begin to explore the body.
How is it that awareness is experienced that way? What does Francis do to enable people to have that experience?
Well,
or what would you do, or Rupert, if you were doing the same thing?
We would close our eyes and first of all welcome the current experience, such as it is, the flow of thoughts and sensations and perceptions, and point out that they're not appearing in nothing, that they're appearing in awareness, or to awareness and in awareness, and then maybe provide an image of the sky-like nature of this awareness when you begin to focus on sensations, or the space-like quality of this awareness. And I mean, if you go to your experience right now, Rick, and you go, you know, to a sensation, for example, the sensation of your hand, the tingling of your hand, and then you tune into this kind of knowing, the feeling, knowing that this tingling of the hand appears in an openness, in a kind of space. So it's like a correlating awareness to space.
So you're pointing out something to people that is already there, that they may have overlooked.
Yes.
And you're enabling them to kind of settle down, because usually the agitation and the outward directedness of our attention is conducive to overlooking, you know, what's already there. Yeah.
To settle down and to take your stand as the welcoming of experience, which is our true nature. But, you know, obviously we are often resisting experience, and there's a lot of tension, as you say, and agitation. So it takes time, but that's the first thing that happens. And then the body is perceived as a flow of sensations and vibrations in this openness. So it's as if you were liberating the body of all the labels, because usually our body is experienced as a kind of layering of tension and contraction. That's kind of the anchoring of the ego at the level of the body. You know, it's like me, the body. So when you start to taste the body free, a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more from a more open perspective, a more safe perspective, then the body, it reveals itself to be more of an innocent flow of sensations.
Yeah.
So that would be, you know, already to do that, that exploration would be a very big exploration to explore the fact that the body is not, I am not in the body is in me.
Mm-hmm.
And me is this openness. That, you know, so that would be a first amazing discovery. You know?
Yeah.
For me, it was like, whoa, because then, of course, you know, I remember I had this kind of chronic fear that was a very intense sensation in my solar plexus. And and I remember, I think, being having to kind of welcome that sensation that I had been repressing and controlling, and then asking Francis, is it really safe, and exploring, etc., etc. And then over the years, the body naturally was relieved of that kind of charge. It was like a me charge, me, I'm going to die and I'm in danger charge, which, so
Yeah.
that, but then there's so many other components to this yoga. You know, you will explore, for example, we're very conditioned to feel that the body ends, or I end where the body ends. And there's a feeling that goes with that. So there will be an exploration of expanding the body into the space. And the space is alive, it's not dead, it's friendly. And then you really go there. You really go and you really realize, oh yeah, it's true. I can't find the place where my body ends and the space begins. There might be also an exploration of weight, of surrendering weight. And realizing,
Weights, like heaviness,
No.
weights?
yes, the sensation of weight, the sensation of me heavy, me solid, me dense, which is another habitual way that the ego perpetuates itself, you could say, physically. So in this approach, there'll be a lot of releasing of the weight into, for example, the surface of the chair or the mat, and then tuning in and sensing that this so-called chair or mat, if you go to your direct experience, there is no chair or mat, there's just this kind of sensation, and then kind of awakening to the aliveness of that sensation, to the vibrational flow of that sensation, and then realizing that your true body is weightless. But it's all a process, you know, and you know, you can't really talk about it and describe it. It's so experiential.
You're doing a pretty good job.
Bit.
Would you
And
say...
there are
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say then there's, you know, exploring movement
Yeah.
and, you know, the habit of feeling that I am the mover. And then, well, you know, just exploring a very simple movement and feeling, evoking the feeling that movement appears in me, that there is no individual mover. And, you know, that's a beautiful discovery, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And there's some explorations with the sense perceptions, with hearing and touching and smelling. And
Would you say that the body actually really enjoys functioning in the way that you are describing, that this yoga evokes? And therefore, if you give it half a chance, you know, if you give it an opportunity, it's going to kind of begin to shift into that mode.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then if you give it repeated opportunities, that mode will become more and more habituated.
Absolutely, yes. It's the natural state at the level of the body.
Yeah.
It's transparency, weightless, relaxed.
So if a person
But
goes
of
to...
course, yoga will also reveal all sorts of layers of emotions, fears, tensions, which is the beauty of that yoga too, is that it creates a kind of openness for many layers to come up to the surface of so-called suffering, habits of what constitutes suffering. And in this yoga, what's beautiful is, you know, you don't do anything with the I feeling that arises. You just, it's as if you offered it to presence. You know, for presence to take care of. It's not you don't have to do anything with the stuff that comes up. It's a very, you know, hands-off approach. Very beautiful.
Yeah. The ocean keeps dissolving spoonful after spoonful of mud and seems to have the capacity to do so.
Exactly. That's a nice image.
Yeah. And this too, I think, is worth dwelling upon, isn't it? Because it's not a matter of just sort of sinking into a more natural state of mental and physiological functioning, but in that more natural state, all of the unnaturalness that has been accumulated over the course of a lifetime no longer, well, the body, wouldn't you say, the body has a natural tendency to want to throw that off. And you're finally giving it an opportunity to do so. And
exactly.
so it naturally begins to happen without your having to poke around and figure out, okay, what do I need to throw off? Let me try to find something. It just surfaces, whatever's ready to go.
Yeah. It does, if it absolutely does, as long as you kind of really truly welcome the body without an agenda, which means that you've taken your stand, or you've taken your right place. You are open, at least, to the possibility that the true I is this openness.
Yeah.
This infinite, ever-present awareness, because then the body is welcomed. It doesn't mean the body relaxes immediately. On the contrary, all of a sudden the body's free to surface. I often have the image of, establishing awareness and then letting the sensations of the body be free to be as they are. And I use an image of opening cages in the body, because we often have put sensations in cage, knots of density and energetic constellations are nice and compact and kept. So just liberating all these different areas of the body for no reason, without any agenda, just to let the body find its own, reorchestrate itself on its own. It doesn't need to be told what to do, this poor body. It's been told what to do.
Well, it seems there's an overarching reason, which is that, we've been carrying around all this baggage for so many years. It would be nice to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So that's a good reason for going. That's a good reason for going to a retreat and sitting down and doing this process.
Yeah, well, that's true, that the motivation for any initial motivation is that we don't want to suffer anymore, and that's a fine motivation.
Yeah. And would you say that during the process there's an oscillation between, deepening and then stuff getting stirred up, and then deepening and then stuff getting stirred up? It just sort of goes in a cycle.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not a universal,
Well,
but is that a kind of a general pattern?
Yeah, and when you went deepening, I would want to say kind of
Expanding.
relax and expanding.
Yeah.
But sometimes deepening too, like in terms of allowing this kind of vibrational aliveness of life, and of body. And then, yes, and then there can be a shrinking back, or a
contraction.
Or contraction can arise that seems to shrink awareness back into itself, and then a surrendering again. So it's a very alive and not an irrational. The exploration with the body, it's not rational at all, which was what was so beautiful with the retreats at Francis. There was these two experiences, one very irrational and the other one very rational. And so it took care of both the mind and the body. And then there was also a dimension of the world, because we explored perception.
In what way?
Well, in the yoga, you might explore hearing and seeing and tasting and touching, and explore experientially, or establish experientially that hearing, tasting, touching, etc. don't appear in a body. A sound doesn't appear in the ear, a taste in the mouth, but that they appear in awareness. And in a way liberating the sense perceptions of this localization in the body.
Yeah.
So that, you've had probably the experience of hearing, where hearing resonates in openness. It's easier maybe with hearing. Anyway,
It is easier with hearing because, and actually I heard Rupert going through something similar to this, or maybe this very thing on that recent audio series that he put out. But when you think of it, we're more familiar with a subtler aspect of the sense of hearing than we are with a subtler aspect of any other sense, and that is thinking. Thoughts are sounds, and they're a subtler aspect of the sense of hearing.
Yes.
So I was reminded of that when you said it might be easier with hearing.
But with thinking, you can do the same. You can explore the fact that there is a kind of feeling a feeling habit that the thinker is located in the head, and there's
Right.
a kind of massive energy sensation there. But you can go to your experience and see very clearly that, you know, thoughts don't appear in the head. Nobody's seen a thought in the head, and that they appear in awareness, just like the sound, just like the sensation of touch, and all these explorations. You know, they're so beautiful. First of all, they're like refinements, and they're like playing music. They're like tuning the instrument, and but they also happen. You know, it's ongoing. I think it's quite important to conduct them over extended periods.
Yeah.
So that was world, but the world part of experience was also taken in Francis's retreat, and also at Rupert's, and I'm sure other teachers, is to do with friendship and the kind of lovely atmosphere amongst the Sangha, and you know, eating together and sharing time together and having the time.
Yeah. There's so many examples and sayings in so many traditions about the value of having a sangha of some kind. You know, I mean, what is it Christ said? Wherever two or three are gathered together in my name, there I am. And
Yeah.
and there, you know, there's so many examples in Eastern scriptures and others about the value of the company of the so-called enlightened, you know, just being in the company of like-minded people who are all seeking the same thing, and how conducive that is to
Yes.
realizing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was very much my experience. The friendships in the Sangha were so sweet, and yeah.
And you met Rupert there.
I met Rupert. Yes.
So that paid
Yeah.
off.
That was the only motivation. Get
Yeah.
me a husband.
Yeah, that was it. You were just sort of on a quest. Here's this handsome Englishman with a cool accent.
Yeah. I had my eyes on him when I first got there.
Yeah,
I had to wait a bit, but
yeah, he's a charming fellow. Have your and Rupert's respective evolutionary processes always been conducive to a kind of a deeper, more intimate relationship, or have they sometimes resulted in one or the other of you becoming somewhat ethereal or disembodied or something like that? That might seem like a strange question, and I can clarify it if you like. But for instance, knowing you and Rupert just to the extent I do, I always find Rupert to totally charming, but kind of cerebral, you know, little ethereal when you talk to him. And then here you are, this, you know, movement, dance, you know, embodiment person. I mean, how has the interaction of those two tendencies played out for you?
well, it's played out. Let's put it that way. It still plays out.
Still playing
I mean,
out?
it's kind of cool because we really see eye to eye with this understanding, and you know, we share a teaching, and you know, we share the teacher, yeah. So that's a kind of real kind of foundation. Not that we refer back to it consciously, but it's such a underlying. It's
Yeah.
kind of there, and we are very different characters. But you know, so.
Of course, Rupert was a
some-
ceramic artist, and that's kind of earthy, you know. That's very
Yeah,
tactile and.
he's not. I wouldn't. You know, he's not. I know what you mean when you say he's cerebral. He loves to think, and he articulates through thought, and he's not. You know, you don't get Rupert to dance very often.
Yeah, I couldn't. You wouldn't get me to dance very often either, so I'm not putting him down. You know, it's just kind of a personality type thing.
So it's been you know, like any relationship, where we're very polarized. So at times it's been explosive, but then, you know, let it be, because we knew that it's gonna resolve, not so much in the whatever conflict, but it resolves a bit later on in understanding. But that kind of friction is so rich, and we learn. I mean, I've learned a lot from Rupert, and I continue to, and I know he does. He doesn't learn from me so much.
He doesn't?
Well, I think he learns a lot, but not. I don't think he adds on to his array of thinking tools, but I definitely think he learns from me on another level, of course.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so it's good. It works.
Do you think that a polarized kind of relationship which has an underlying common denominator, such as yours, is perhaps, well, first of all, a polarized relationship without that common denominator would probably be hell and probably wouldn't work out. But one with a common denominator, do you think that would be more evolutionary, and we're speaking somewhat hypothetically, than one in which, you know, which wasn't very polarized at all?
More revolutionary, did you say?
More evolutionary. Do you think there's more opportunity for growth and change and maturation and so on in a you know, a sugar and salt kind of relationship that, you know, than there would be in a salt sort of relationship, or a salt and pepper, I should say.
I don't really know. I know there's a great deal of learning potential in my situation with Rupert and, you know, with our relationship, but I don't have a
I'm just curious. I mean, the thought just occurred to me. It wasn't a pre-planned question, but
no.
You know, people talk about finding a compatible mate and so on. And do you really want a compatible mate that's kind of like a you know, perfect fit on all levels, or is there going to be some greater potential in a situation in which the two of you have some significant differences, but there's an underlying you know, common denominator?
I mean, I think it's very important to have shared interests, not just the one underlying common denominator, but also, like Rupert and I share, you know, a love of nature and love of beauty. Mm-hmm. We like classical music. I mean, the little things like that we enjoy doing. And then, so that the polarities of our characters, it's as if God, you know, took, you know, it felt like a match, almost like an arranged marriage a little bit.
I know what you mean.
Because, I didn't, you know, I had just moved to Temecula to kind of live nearby Francis, and I was happily single, and then it just kind of appeared on the radar, and there we were. I moved to England, and I felt like, okay, this must be the next kind of face of the teaching. And I mean, I knew it was, to be honest. I think it's one of the most important ways that I have been given to explore this understanding and to refine it. And it's been it is challenging at times, but yeah, I'm not answering your question directly, because it could have been that
you kind of are.
that Rupert could have been more like me, and it would have been equally.
Yeah, but I guess my question is, if he had been, you know, and this is again hypothetical. I think you're obviously, as you just said, you're meant to be together. But if he had been, would that have actually been as evolutionary? And I'm asking this not just about you and Rupert, but for people out there who, you know, might feel like, you know, geez, you know, my husband is this and I'm that, and where's the value in this? But perhaps there could be.
I think if there's a genuine interest in exploring and intimacy with this reference point of the understanding somehow, but so that the other becomes somehow a yoga at times. You know, the differences, the thing that is difficult in the other's character, it challenges you, and that's a kind of yoga of sorts. Mm-hmm. Or at other times it's a kind of celebration.
Carlos Castaneda talked about the value of the petty tyrant. Not that either of you are tyrants, but he said even very challenging people and situations can be a gift because they have such
They bring out, like, at times the absolute, it pushed the button like right, or the edges, and then you really have to see it. And I remember early on with Rupert in our relationship, we were having some kind of conflict, and he told me, and he kind of said to me, like, straight on, he said, "Ellen, don't go for the relationship, go for the truth." And it was such a kind of wake up. I knew exactly what he meant, but it was so good that he said it, and it's a little bit, it's very important, that statement, that whenever we hit a kind of difficult spot, the tendency, of course, in conflict in a relationship is to blame and to niddle and want to resolve it, and I get caught in that, but ultimately there will be a moment, hopefully, more and more, where I take it back to to the absolute, or not the absolute up there, but to the truth, to honestly, you know, to love, you know, to a more impersonal understanding.
Yeah.
And in the process of that, there's a lot that is getting to grow up, to mature, to open, to it's good.
Culturing patience, tolerance, forgiveness,
Yeah.
compassion, all
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, taking it to a kind of a cosmic perspective, which we've alluded to a few times, I mean, you know, if the world is not mechanistic and just a sort of a, you know, if it really is imbued with intelligence, which is orchestrating things for the purpose of our higher good, for the purpose of our evolution, then every little thing is a lesson, right? And every person we engage with is our teacher.
Yes, that's true. I agree with that.
Yeah. So I read a lot in your piece on the internet about this woman, Janet Adler. Is she still alive?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
is she getting old, or what's her story?
She's probably in her late 70s now. I haven't seen her in quite a few years. She lives in Vancouver, on one of those islands off Vancouver.
I'll be darned. Huh, I'm going out there in September.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Maybe I can interview her.
Yeah.
So I'm
she's
sorry. Go
written
ahead.
a couple of books.
Mm-hmm.
She's written a couple of books, and she had a kind of Kundalini awakening when she was in her 40s, and it came through, you know, in the form of very intense visions, but also intense energy in the body. And she didn't have a context within which to kind of approach this. She wasn't in a particular spiritual teaching, etc. So she was a dance therapist. And the way she kind of worked with this energy or met it was through this practice of authentic movement, which she hadn't created, but she kind of tailored it to this kind of spiritual experience that was kind of bursting through her. And I read her book when I was prior to meeting Francis, and I was so drawn to that kind of exploration, but I didn't quite know why. There was something about her book and the allowing of the body and the fascination for energy and the kind of natural unfolding, kind of mystical unfolding of the body through spontaneous mudras or gestures or postures. That was something that I kind of knew in my own experience, and it was very interesting to me. And I sought her out and studied, so to speak. I mean, I was with her for quite a few years. And then in the middle of the working with her, I met Francis, and it really had a radical effect on how I understood authentic movement. She always talked about unitive states of consciousness, and she was never exposed to the non-dual teaching, so she wouldn't ever formulate it the way that I then began to formulate it after I met Francis. So we never disagreed, but we just kind of parted ways after that, soon after that. But I kept the form of authentic movement as something that I still work with clients.
Yeah. Is that a pretty major part of what you do with clients still?
If they, yes, if they want to. Some people come to me especially for that. And then that's what we do. We talk, of course, but during the course of a session, there'll be a period of time where they will close their eyes and just allow an unfolding, and in some cases over many years, so that there's I don't know how to describe this. It's hard to talk about, but it's a very beautiful. In the beginning, you know, people might come because they're having very unexplainable, energetic experiences, sometimes with visions, sometimes with the kind of memories from past lives, and in this practice, it's just a time where that can be, and I'm just witnessing, and and then there's a time to just speak. So it's very simple in the sense that there's no hands-on, there's no doing anything with anybody, there's no manipulating the body. And but sometimes, because of the background, the non-dual background, the understanding that it's all unfolding in awareness, and that ultimately it's completely safe, and everything, the reality of everything is awareness, so that people might come with these energetic phenomena. And I've often now seen that it's people who have had maybe trauma in their early childhood, very invasive, maybe trauma, maybe sexual, or, and that propelled, that triggered an out-of-body experience because it was too intense. And the out-of-body experience was a spiritual glimpse. So that later in life, there is a kind of confusion, but it's not rational. It's right at the level of the body, a confusion between fear, terror, the trauma, and the spiritual longing. I mean, that's how I articulate it. I don't really know, you know, and I don't really need to know. But so authentic movement is often a place where that can begin to disentangle. The fear part begins to relax in the knowledge that it's welcome, that there's infinite space, and that the body can relax. And then the visionary aspect, or the glimpses, begins to fully take a shape, sometimes just in a recognition of peace, and through the body, maybe in very precise shapes the body wants to take, or very clear movements. It's very beautiful because it's spontaneous. It's a kind of spontaneous harmonizing of the body with its true nature. And in each mover, it will look differently. But it's also quite, it's not always beautiful. I mean, it also allows lots of different layers.
And different stuff, yeah. Well, it sounds like what you're saying, from what you're saying, that firstly, it's kind of common for people these days to be having these energetic eruptions, and either that or they're just seeking you out. But I wonder if there's more people having that these days than there was 30, 40 years ago. That's one question. And you're also saying that, you know, there seems to be a correlation between people having that and having been traumatized, you know, sexually assaulted or whatever in their childhood. Given that,
or pain body, you know, that notion.
Pain body.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
Carry on.
Well, yeah. I mean, and where does the pain body come from? Doesn't it come from traumatic experiences, perhaps?
Yeah.
And so I guess the question. So there's stuff you could talk about on those 2 points, but then the third point is, this might seem strange, but our traumatic experiences, sometimes horrific ones, some kind of a hidden blessing in that they become catalysts for spiritual awakening later in life, which is kind of what you just said.
Yes, they are. They are, in a way. Any suffering, if it's a call to come back home. It's, you know, it's not to say that it's not extremely painful. Sometimes excruciating, and you know, and but if in fact it does allow for an awakening, then it is a blessing. It is absolutely a blessing.
Yeah, I know. In my own case, my childhood was pretty rough. Alcoholic father, mother tried to commit suicide 3 times. You know, all kinds of heavy-duty stuff, and it was pretty much at my wit's end by the age of about 17, 18 years old. And when I finally kind of latched onto spirituality, I just took off like a bat out of hell, because it was such a relief, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I think it is a relief when I work with those clients, and it's the suggestion I really see often. It's a suggestion that it's safe, but not just safe intellectually, but actually physically and energetically. When they are in the throes of this energy, and their eyes are closed, I might just, you know, throw out some words that really evoke the kind of openness, or the holding of the earth, or, you know, some images that this little body doesn't have to take care of it all, you know, and it's a kind of reintroducing love to that equation, that problematic, you know, reintroducing love, and then things begin to unwind, and the trauma can resolve in its own time. So then, of course, you know, and then the story of the trauma is very important to be allowed, and it needs to be said and explored. But then there comes a time where that's done, and that can be laid to rest. But there can still be that those people who are drawn, whose portals into the spiritual life has been the body and the energy, they'll still maybe have an affinity for that. And that's a very beautiful thing that I found, is that people keep coming, and there's no longer the trauma or there's just this longing to close their eyes and be moved. And it's almost like they become the I feel blessed, you know, in those moments, witnessing these movers. I feel like it's darshan, and I think how strange that I think our culture has forgotten these rituals, but these must have been rituals. This is a ritual. It feels like a kind of natural ritual that, you know, and not everybody would do it, would be drawn to it, but some people.
Yeah. Well, not everybody's drawn to anything, you know, but it sounds like a useful tool.
It can be, yes.
And you have to do it with you. Do you have to come to Oxford, or do you have Skype sessions or something with people?
I tried that once, but it's just not.
Wouldn't work with movement. No.
No, you need to be together in the space. I mean, I only tried it once with one client, and we gave it up quite soon.
Yeah. Do you do sessions with clients over Skype that don't involve the movement thing?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. And there you can still explore the sensations and feelings in the body, but not so much with movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I was wondering about when I was reading about the movement thing is that, you know, Janet Adler had a profound energetic awakening, and for her the movements, I guess, were kind of expressions of that raging energy that she was experiencing. But if you don't have that sort of energetic awakening and you try to engage in something like this, aren't you just mimicking the external appearances of what Janet was doing, and just kind of going through the motions, or perhaps just stirring up sort of a mood or an imaginary thing, rather than what Janet was actually referring to?
You're right. Yeah. You're right. Sometimes, and I used to facilitate groups, and that would take place. There was this kind of exactly as you say, this kind of stirring up stuff that doesn't need stirring up.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't like that. I didn't like facilitating groups like that, and so I don't actually advertise that the authentic movement a bit too much. That the people who come, it usually is people who kind of need to explore in that way. Yeah. But otherwise, it's not necessary.
Yeah, so you wouldn't really get into the authentic movement thing with somebody unless they did had an energetic awakening, and then it might be an appropriate tool.
Yeah, or they might say, I'm really drawn to it. Yeah. They might not have an energetic, but there's something in them that resonates, and usually they close their eyes, and you kind of get why they wanted to. You can see that it's like something that finally can come up to the surface, and it's of another order maybe, or it's just not. It's so hard to put into words, but
I understand.
Yeah.
I have a few notes I took about it here. Authentic movement, devotional expression of non-duality, being moved, connects you with reality, true nature.
It does, and it's what I remember in my own experience of when I moved was I would always start with suffering in a way. You know, I would always start with the sense of me separate, and instead of trying to, instead of fighting it or trying to make my way back to my understanding, I would just really, in a way, penetrate this resistance, because it was a resistance, a density, an energy, and then there would be a kind of personal emotional component of anger or whatever, and that would be completely allowed too. And, you know, it's sometimes so pleasurable and so important to let this me out of the box, you know, completely. Who cares at that moment if it's not me, or it just, and then if it's allowed completely, then the personal component of the emotion begins to relax, and then the emotion is pure, and it's just pure, maybe grief or pure rage, which then paves the way for its, you know, it's God's grief, or it's God's anger, or it's God's emotion, and then it then really begins to find its own move. I mean, it really then, the form is unfolds. And I remember arriving at the end of these sessions and really, at the time there were still states though, you know, and I would seek them out. I would want them again and again, of that states of purity and a sense of you know, of silence and emptiness and expansion.
That you would get into in these authentic movement things with Janet, you're
Yeah,
saying? Yeah.
Yes. But they were only recognized as unitive states, and then later I was able to somehow understand the whole process from awareness. It's awareness from beginning to end, but
Yeah.
it's not that I arrive at awareness. I started at awareness. So.
Well, weren't those tastes of unitive states kind of, wasn't it a similar mechanics to that which you began to go through with Francis, but just through a different means? I mean, in his case, it's, you know, you mentioned glimpses and repeated glimpses and deepening glimpses and so on. I mean, isn't it just another tool? Wasn't it just another tool for having glimpses of that same true nature?
Except with Janet, it was never formulated as the ground. The fact of awareness was our ever-present, immediate, direct experience now and now. You know, so there was a kind of evolution from personal consciousness to, she called it collective consciousness, to unitive consciousness. Whereas I now would disagree. If I had to, you know, formulate it, I wouldn't formulate it like that. I felt that was misleading. Although I feel that it was misleading from the point of view of the formulation, but the experience was beautiful. And
sounds like she didn't have a teacher the way Francis did, so she didn't have that kind of structure for understanding and explaining it.
Yes, her background was more Jungian psychology, and then this kind of spiritual, mystical, more shamanic, maybe you could say. And then she did it all by herself. You know, she had a teacher, I think, but I don't remember who he was. Huh. Not non-dual teacher, but some kind of mentor.
Yeah. Okay. This is an interesting point you brought out. Let's see here. A couple of interesting points. One was from Janet about the relationship between surrender and will regarding my experience with the energy. I lifted that phrase from that article he wrote. That's something I've personally found interesting over the years, the kind of the balancing act between surrender and will, especially when, I mean, one could imagine that surrender had taken place to a very profound degree in which will was really had taken a back seat, and the kind of divine will is running the show. But before you get to that point, there can be years of transitionary period where, you know, there's a kind of a tug of war or a balancing act between those two things, and one has to learn discernment in terms of what is my individual will and what is cosmic will, if you want to use that phrase. You know, should I follow this impulse, or is that just a whim? Yeah. Is that an individual whim, or am I being told something here?
Yeah. Well, you see, I know what you mean, but I also want to say that it's all cosmic universal will.
Yeah.
No.
But if you go to that, then the murderer is just carrying out universal will, and Hitler was carrying out universal will. But yeah, I'm talking about
in your own experience.
In one's own experience, especially in the context of.
You're right. In your own experience, when I say it's all cosmic will, I'm not saying it to be facile, but I think it's when you're involved in an exploration where you're, for example, experiencing personal will and then the unfolding, the kind of spontaneous, effortless unfolding, and they kind of that which is experiencing those two is awareness. I mean, it's true.
Yeah.
It is being perceived and unfolding in awareness. So, and it's really important that it's not just a bypass to say that, because once you really see that, you realize that the moments of so-called personal will are really moments of tension or subtle resistance, a kind of contraction back into a sense of separation. And there's no problem, but it's seen clearly. It's seen clearly that, oh, here's the me feeling, me, the body feeling, or, oh, here's fear, here's, in other words, you've got the key. It doesn't really matter. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Maybe one way of clarifying my question is just to take an example, I've been having some conversations recently with several friends who are spiritual teachers, and we've been talking about spiritual teachers who get a little drunk with the Shakti or with the attention that they receive and so on, and begin to regard themselves as just following divine impulses, and kind of lose the ability to be open to feedback from students, and begin to feel that whatever thought pops in their head basically is like divinely orchestrated and should be believed and followed and trusted both by themselves and by their followers. And that one can go very far off the deep end with that line of thinking and
I see what you're saying.
Get into serious trouble. So that's just a case in point, but obviously most people listening to this aren't spiritual teachers, yet we still have kind of we're definitely moved by, I'd say, a higher purpose and by kind of cosmic intelligence, and yet at the same time we have our individual will and our individual intelligence, which can either be at odds with or in tune with, to varying degrees, that cosmic intelligence.
Yeah, well, that's a nice way to put it. And when it's at odds, because the compass is the truth of our true nature, ideally. When our current person, the small person, is at odds with that compass, when there's a feeling like I'm going to get that, if we're truth lovers and we're honest, at that moment we're like, whoa, we catch ourselves red-handed.
Catch ourselves.
And therefore, there's the freedom. Oh, I can investigate this moment, and that means kind of tracing this contraction, this me feeling, this right back to its root, which more often than not is a feeling, a fear, or a kind of root feeling, a root feeling of separation. So it's not. So it's good.
Yeah. Well, one solution that came to mind as you were speaking is that it really is valuable to have a
good compass.
A good compass. It's valuable also to have a teacher and a sangha who can call you on your shit, if you're getting carried away.
Yes. If you have responsibility and you're a teacher, I mean, it's very important that you have some kind of reference, and that your sangha can, as you say, call you on your shit.
Because if you don't have that, people can go quite far off the beam before they somehow have a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Here's a question that somebody just sent in. Let me read it to you. Hi, Ellen. Many speakers talk about the necessity of placing attention on uncomfortable feelings and contractions in the body in order to heal them. But I have found this practice to be counterproductive and even damaging to my nervous system. For even if we think we are doing this compassionately, without judgment, this type of attention carries the ego's intention to change and fix, which is, in itself, an act of violence and contradictory to healing. Moreover, my experience has been that so much focus on, quote, somatic contractions, unquote, actually perpetuates these sensations until they become all that we notice, betraying the truth that they are only a small fragment of experience. What are your thoughts about this? It's a great question.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So you can indulge in it too much.
I think it's. I like what you say about the violence. I think the questioner used the word violence and agendas, and I think that if there's an agenda, it's a form of violence with the body, and in the approach that I share and that Francis, and the Kashmir approach, it's a very non-violent approach. It's you're right. There isn't really a focusing in areas of contraction. It's more a global welcoming of the body and the world and everything. But then when you do start to focus on the body, you know, you're kind of offering the body to presence. So, and of course, sometimes you might become aware of areas of tension and contractions, and it might be that the invitation of the moment is to kind of allow that sensation to unfold, but not. It's a subtle balancing. Like you're not expecting the sensation to go away. You're really seeing it clearly for what it is, and your interest is in awareness, in spaciousness, in the openness. So the byproduct of such a non-violent approach, you could say, is often relaxation. But there isn't an agenda for things to relax necessarily.
Yeah, you know, this question plays right into the question I was asking you, which is this sort of balance between individual intention and cosmic will. I'm using cosmic will as a general phrase. I think people understand what I mean by that. But you know, this person's inquiry has to do with the individual ego's intention to change and fix, to use the questioner's exact words, where one is applying individual will. And to me, that's like almost in the same ballpark as, you know, individually having to make our heart beat and our blood circulate and our liver do its thing, you know, which we would die if we had to do that. Whereas there are kind of more deeper, there's a deeper intelligence which conducts those processes. And I think there can also, and that same deeper intelligence can conduct this process of purification that you're...
Without anybody...
Yeah, without our individual manipulation being involved.
In a way, the individual manipulation is yet another tension that has that is also a sensation in the body. It's a kind of doing tension, which itself will, in the best of cases, be welcomed in the sense of just allowed. But as you say, Rick, our true nature is, by definition, allowing at every moment, and therefore doesn't need to do anything.
Yeah. All right, we had a bit of an interruption there, but we were talking about how one can exacerbate, the questioner was asking, one can exacerbate sort of individual discomforts and you know, stuck things if one is using one's personal will to root them out. It's almost like that to which we give our attention grows stronger in our life, whereas I think you're talking about a very different process which might easily be confused with that, in which we're surrendering to something much larger than our individuality, and that kind of has natural purifying tendencies which take care of it for us if we surrender to it properly.
Yeah, it takes care of the part of a contraction that is egoic, like the me part of a feeling in the body. Once we take our stand as this infinite, open, welcoming awareness, eventually the body relaxes. The me part of the tension goes back to the real me, to presence. So, but that doesn't mean that there might not be chronic tensions in the body that's still floating around. They're just sensations, and some might be less pleasant than others, but they're just sensations. But if it's a psychological contraction, and if you approach that psychological contraction with a kind of focus and a kind of, I'm gonna welcome that somatic tension, and I'm gonna welcome it. That's just superimposing yet another layer of tension. That's not very welcoming. As Francis says, that's like you're just standing behind the door with a 4x5, waiting to plonk the sensation. You have an agenda, and an agenda, as this person points out, is a form of meddling with experience.
Yeah, there's that bumper sticker: "Let go and let God."
Yeah, that's nice.
So some people might be hearing this and thinking, all right, I got that point. You know, you should, you know, if you're really surrendered to to your true nature, and then things are going to kind of work themselves out in a way that is far more wise and effective than anything your individual will would be able to accomplish. But that kind of begs the question, how do you surrender to your true nature? I mean, a lot of people might, out there listening to this, might feel like, I understand that, but it hasn't happened. Well, how do I get in touch with it? It hasn't happened for me yet. How do I make that happen?
Keep looking. Because you shouldn't surrender to your true nature if you haven't
found it.
Yeah. Why would you? That would be blind surrender. But if you're really interested in who am I, what am I, am I real? You know, am I this body mind, or am I? If there's a real interest in that, then one must pursue it, or not one must, but one would.
Yeah.
And if it's a real interest, there will be answers. There's good teaching out there, and I can give a few recommendations.
Sure. There's you, there's Rupert, there's Francis.
Exactly.
And some other good people scattered all around.
But one must stay looking and investigating and asking questions until those questions are met. And then it's not sequential like that, but the surrendering has to be towards something that is trustworthy and true.
So
that one might lose sight of, but yet one knows without the shadow of a doubt. One knows, even if at times it's out of sight, it's out of reach. Seems to be. It's the one thing you know for sure somehow. You know.
Yeah. And over time, it becomes less and less out of sight, out of reach.
Yes.
So how would you reconcile, you know, seek and ye shall find, knock and the door shall be opened, with the sort of give up the search crowd and you don't need a teacher crowd?
I don't try to reconcile that.
Well, in other words, you're probably saying you disagree with that crowd and you know, seek and ye shall find.
If they're not seeking, then that's fine, good for them. But if you're seeking, then it's good to seek, and yes, you should find. Mm-hmm. As long as there's a seeker there, you can't pretend there isn't a seeker there. And as long as there's a sense of personal, of a limited me that yet has an intuition that there's a bigger truth, there's something more, there's the possibility for freedom. It's so important to really go for that and not listen to whatever teaching tells you nothing, no one there, nothing to do, before that's really recognized to be true. No, keep looking. As long as there seems to be someone there, then that someone should be doing something.
Good.
Towards.
Couldn't have said it better.
Thank you.
So be true to yourself. Don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's so miraculous when you are true to yourself. You know, life meets itself. Truth is met by truth, and and of course, when we say these things, it sounds so beautiful, but that doesn't mean that it's not a journey, a real process, and at times difficult, painful. But yet, looking back on it, you think, wow, what intelligence.
Here's a nice phrase I found in what you wrote. As we travel in and through the dark unknown, we may emerge back into the light of wholeness. This can only happen through our bodies.
Did I write that?
You did, yeah. But, unless you plagiarized it, I don't know.
Years ago.
Yeah, it was years ago.
I'm not sure I would agree with. I mean, it's true, but it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I actually should have. I was getting distracted by your little quotes here, but I should have picked up on what you just said, which is beautiful, which is it's a journey, and and it's, you know, it's an adventure, and it's never-ending fascination as far as I'm concerned. It's like, you know, you might give up the search, but boy, you don't give up the exploration and the adventure.
Well, there was a quote that Rupert and I found in a book, and I can't remember the book, so I don't know who said this, but it was a beautiful quote, and it goes something like, first first we journey towards God and then we journey in God.
Nice, very nice.
It's nice because it's so true, isn't it? So,
Yeah, love that. And then we journey as God.
yeah.
Could add that.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And we've been doing that all along, thinking that we were doing those other things.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, so Dan, if there's any more questions that have come in, now would be the time to send them to me. And otherwise, this is a typical question that I always ask towards the end of interviews, which is, and with some people, when I ask this question, well, basically the question is, you know, how do you see the cutting edge of your evolution now? You know, what does the next horizon seem to be, or what have the recent horizons been? And some people look at me puzzled because they're of the sort of I'm done ilk, and so that question doesn't get us very far. But in your case, you seem to have this sense of, you know, never-ending unfoldment, and also, what are some areas in which you feel that you know, you've been blossoming in recent months or years, and that you look forward to continue to blossom in?
Well, I guess perhaps in sharing this understanding, and especially with what's so-called yoga, the awakening body sessions that I offer, I feel that I really enjoy those, and that I want to give my energy to those.
But in your own personal experience, how do you feel?
But I think that it is because I've always been a bit lacking in confidence and a little bit shy, not shy, so often craving, but a little bit shy to really give, not shy, but it was difficult for me to manifest. So I think that the teaching, the next unfolding, or the unfolding, is taking me out into the world a bit more. So its relevance in that way. Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Good. Well, this interview may help in terms of, you know, people usually experience what I call the back gap bump.
Yes, I've heard you use that experience.
You know, and so let's say people feel a resonance with you and like what you've been saying in this interview. In what ways can they get involved with you?
Well, I guess they can come.
To
I do
Oxford.
teach well, no, I teach also in America and in other countries in Europe, and I have a website, so they can go check on my website, or they can come to Oxford or London.
We actually have a thing on Back Gap under the past interviews menu where teachers such as yourself can, and many have, put in places where they are going to be teaching. Or,
Oh, okay.
And then a person could search, let's say, in Fresno or whatever, wherever,
Yeah.
or California. They could
Yeah.
broaden it out to the whole state, and then they can see,
Yeah.
oh, all these people are going to be teaching in this, that, and the other city.
Right.
So we'll send you
Okay.
information on how to register for that, and people who are listening can check that out and find out what might be going on in their area.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. So good. Let me kind of wrap it up. Unless you can think of anything else we haven't covered that you'd like to throw in there.
I think we've talked a lot.
Okay, good. I always enjoy making these interviews long because it's so much fun talking to people like you.
It's
I just
really nice.
want to do it all day, you know.
That's great because
Yeah.
you have time. You give time for real conversations.
Yeah, yeah, and no commercials.
Yeah.
Except those annoying little YouTube ads that come up. Okay, so I've been speaking with Ellen Emmett, and this interview, as most of you watching or listening probably know, is part of an ongoing series. So if you'd like to check out previous ones, go to batgap.com, and there's a past interviews menu where you'll see all the past interviews organized or categorized in about 4 or 5 different ways, alphabetical, chronological, and so on. Check that out. There is an audio podcast of this that almost as many people listen to the audio recordings as watch the videos, and there's a whole page on how to sign up for that. You'll see it there. If you look under the upcoming interviews menu, especially, the upcoming interviews menu, you'll see this thing I referred to earlier of the live streaming and links to the live streaming for each one. and a form at the bottom through which you can submit questions. There's a donate button, which we rely upon people clicking if they feel they're deriving value from this, and it helps to support it. And there's also a little link to be notified by email each time a new interview is posted, so you'll see that. So thanks for listening or watching, and thank you, Ellen.
Thank you very much.
Say hi to Rupert. We'll see you both
I
in
will.
October at the SAND conference.
Good.
And my next interview won't be a week from today. It'll be 2 days from today with Amma Sri Karunamai, who's a saint from India, and that got organized sort of on the spur of the moment. It should be quite different from many of my interviews, and I think quite fascinating. So stay tuned for that. So see you then. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Ellen.
Bye, Rick. Lovely.
Yeah.